Well, I don't know if I'm going to talk about NIPIPE in this talk, but yes, there is a world of open that I really appreciate and embrace. And I think talking about Tom Insel's question earlier about when will data be available, I think that's something we will come back to towards the end of this talk as to how to make data open and available. But I want to start off just by acknowledging some folks, in particular Greg Ciccarelli, who's a recent graduate from MIT, who's done a lot of the work that I will be talking about, and generous funding from a variety of different sources. But in particular, I might want to just point you to the bottom of that slide that a lot of this wouldn't be possible without having access to data and open software. And I think that's a key element of something we don't always talk about when we think about science. But there is a world of data science which is enabled by open software. So this is not new to this audience over here. Mental illnesses affect 25% adults, 18% adolescents, and 13% of children. Now, if we could make even a small shift, whether in treatment and diagnosis, the numbers are still pretty large. We don't have to make a 100% shift to affect change. We can make changes with small amounts of shifts. And some of the work I'm going to talk about today in the context of speech or voice as biomarkers enable us to shift that dialogue a little bit. I'm not saying we're there fully, but it allows us to think about it. But I want to start off with speech and the brain. I teach a course on speech. So this has always been a favorite video of mine, and I'm going to start it if I can, and jump to 36.
A pen. He, di, he, da, he, gi, he, ga, ya. Why did Ken set the soggy net on top of his deck? I have put blood on her 2 clean yellow shoes. Stop.
Many of you may not have ever seen this before, but this video is now about 55 years old. At a time when IRB rules didn't quite operate the same way as we do today, this is full-frame X-ray video. But it also is one of the most incredible things about something we do so effortlessly that we don't think about the underlying biomechanical constructs that produce speech. And part of the goal here is to think about this. But we've been talking about speech not just recently. This is a poem translated from Latin from the 12th century. And I'll read just a few pieces out of it. Air provides a substance, and the instrument of speech the form. From these, to sound derives the shape and essence of speech. For the tongue forges sounds to the form and image of speech and serves as a hammer in the process. Having first been admitted to the ear as though to the outer vestibule, the voice calls out and is admitted to the inner rooms. The ear keeps outside the rhythm and the resonance of the words, but the thought signified gains admittance. The ear interprets what comes from without, the tongue reveals what is within, and each requires the aid of the other. The speech waveform is very information-rich. The fact that people have been looking at speech recognition for about 30-plus years now gives us a lot of insight into how we speak. We can look at things in the time domain. We can look at things in the spectral domain. We can look at things from the perspective of words, because words matter, right? But speech engages numerous cognitive and physiological processes. In particular, it is an interaction. It's a self-reflection as well as an interaction. So we are looking at a process that interacts within oneself. I'm listening to what I'm saying, and I'm adjusting what I'm saying. I'm listening to how you are reacting to things and perhaps adjusting some of the things that I'm saying. But it also is a complex biomechanical process that involves over 100-plus muscles that interact together. So a big chunk of the brain, its real estate, is devoted to speech production. And in fact, unlike many things in neuroscience, this is something we can do at an individual level repeatedly, ask people to go into the scanner, say something, and compare it to when they're not saying anything, and robustly observe in each individual this large real estate of the brain. So it only makes sense that we can think about this vocal output, which we see as observations through some things like a microphone or through our ears, as connecting to a much more complex mechanical biomechanical structure inside the body, which is then controlled by a complex network in the brain. And so it only makes sense to think about the vocal output as a potential marker for various kinds of cognitive states. Now, we don't have all the pieces yet, but we have been able to show over the years that some of these things are related to some of these underlying states. Further, we can start modeling this, and that's something we don't always talk about. The fact that if we have a model of some object, we actually can make that tractable. And as Roger Baxter, I think, said, all models are wrong, but some are useful. This model is wrong, but it's useful. It helps us to explain various behavioral characteristics of speech. Now, this is looking at the acoustics and phonetic levels of speech motor control, speech learning, and speech execution. But what we can start thinking about is how this then connects to a more general cognitive architecture, through a more general affective architecture. So this brings me to the second part, which is vocal monitoring of mental health. Well, when we think about mental health, well, the first thing we're saying, mental health, so it must be the brain. So that's where we should be looking at, and that's where we started. So these were people watching with social anxiety disorder, watching images inside an fMRI scanner. And what we were able to show was that we were able to predict treatment outcome based on images they saw and their brain responses prior to treatment, much better than just clinical diagnosis or clinical predictors. This was then switched over by a colleague, Susan Whitfield-Gabrielli, to look at diffusion imaging and resting state imaging, two things that don't require an individual to perform any task. And within that context, what we found was that we were able to explain up to about 60% of the variance in treatment, compared to about 12% from just the clinical markers alone. Well, we've also done this, not to forget the structural side of imaging. This is in depression treatment. We've been able to show in a very small pilot study that structural features extracted from brains, this is with a colleague, Arno Klein, who created the program MindBoggle, was able to predict with about an 83% F1 score, think of it as accuracy, people who remitted and non-remitted. So there's information in brain imaging things, but unfortunately, we can't scale this up very rapidly. And that's really where voice comes in. And the advent of many data sets that are out there, and this is already a partly older slide at this point in time. There are data sets on depression, there are data sets on Parkinson that people can use. Now, this is still a tiny fraction of what I would like to see available, but they exist. And what we have, because of the extended work that people have been doing on speech recognition, is a whole host of feature extraction tools and openly available software that can be used to analyze these things. Now, you could also say, I can do a search on YouTube, and if you type depression in YouTube, you'll get about 2 million results. Unfortunately, they're not the right kind of data to filter through to build up these models. And you'll need a lot of filtering to get at the right kind of data through something like YouTube. But once you get that, then you can apply these tools quite easily to get at things. But it also still seems to be a place where people can come up with novel features. So our collaborators at MIT Lincoln Lab have been building a couple of new features. New is hard when you have a 30-year-old enterprise. But it seems like some of these things haven't yet been tackled on. And so one of the things is quite simple, which is when we speak sentences, various passages, we can break it down, just like we do for speech recognition, into individual pieces and measure properties of those pieces. Now, the switchboard corpus is one of the things that has been used in speech recognition literature for years. The word probably does not appear once in the corpus as pronounced as probably, because most of us say things like probably, prob, and depending on the context, we eat up a lot of different things. So speech varies, and it's in that intrinsic variability that we find the power to look at things. So the other feature that they've been looking at is vocal tract resonances that we can infer from the acoustics, and that we can then cross-correlate or to figure out ways in which they map onto each other. and we can look at the correlation matrix of these lagged correlations, which not only gives us some informative visualizations like that, but we can analyze them through eigen decomposition. So what they did was they took these kinds of features and applied it to the AVIC dataset, which was an international competition that ran in 2013 and 14 and actually continues to run. And they were able to predict depression levels both at a correlational level of about 0.73, but at some very high AUC rates, including voice features in year 1 and voice and facial features. And I know LP is going to be talking a lot more about voice and video integration in the next talk. But what Greg was able to do was he was able to take this model of speech production and say, okay, this model acts like a mimic. It can learn how to speak. So we can extract internal features or parameters from these models and look at internal representations. And while it doesn't solve everything, it's a good start to thinking about how to integrate modeling into speech analysis. So this was applied to a Parkinson challenge more recently, where again, we extracted various sets of features. In fact, only the 10th feature in this list corresponds to this kind of modeling feature. But what we were able to see is that the UPDRS score shows structural differences, and again, that same kind of correlational analysis. And if you look at the eigen spectrum, we start seeing differences between low, medium, and high UPDRS levels. So there's some information in this structure that we can extract. I'm not going to go too much into the details of this analysis, but we got some ridiculous numbers on a held-out data set. I don't believe this for a second. I think we just got lucky. But we did some work to get at some novel features and things that may have helped us in this particular set of data. But again, the need for open data is to validate these findings. We need to be able to extend these ideas to larger data sets. So I'm going to switch gear. We talked about depression. This is a plot of predicted BDI scores versus true BDI scores from just a sustained vowel. People were saying ah for as long as they could. And this is just analyzing that and relating to the Beck Depression Inventory, which is a self-assessment. And what we can see over here is that most dots are on the diagonal. There's a bunch of dots on the left side. So we're getting a fair bit of false positives, but very little amounts of false negatives. But this is just from somebody saying an ah. In fact, what we have is that we have an AUC score of about 70 over here, which is pretty nice for something like a sustained vowel. We're able to show in a local cohort that when we look at some phonetic characteristics, we can relate this BDI within the patient group if we look at BDI over 14, but we don't see any variation within the control group. So you could take something like a sustained vowel and classify people into two groups, and then skip out to the more phonetic analysis to look at things within the depressed list. And it turns out that we were able to see some of these things within the context of people doing the speaking task in the scanner. People who were depressed showed greater activity, lower activity in the putamen relative to people who were active controls. And we see a clear relation between the activity levels in the putamen while they were speaking with respect to controls. Okay. But we only talk about one piece of speech production, which is these lower acoustic levels. And as Armin pointed out, and there are other people who pointed out, you can go all the way up the scale to the level of language. So I know I have to finish up in about a minute or so. So I'm going to run through these ideas because a lot of these have been talked about. Speech is just one thing. I love speech, but that's not the only thing we need to be looking at. We need to be looking at deep longitudinal phenotyping and relating all of these things. Our body is a source of big data. A modern car has 400 sensors. We have almost 0. So we have internal sensors, but external sensors are very few. We need to be able to provide useful information based on these sensors back to individuals. So this was Arno reflecting something from the Sage Bionetworks Empower app showing sensor data before and after medication on a daily basis. Even giving this kind of feedback to individuals, whether caregivers or patients, can be quite useful. The one thing I did want to point out a little bit is that we've heard about a number of different apps or app frameworks here today. we need to be able to integrate across, oh, that was me, integrate across these frameworks. And one of the areas where we are moving this idea is the idea of a personal data store. As researchers, as institutions, data has become a commodity. And one thing we need to get out is how we integrate individuals into this loop. So I'm going to skip this for now. Could we empower individuals and analytics in one place? What if all of us had a digital record of ourselves, combining all of this phenotypic information? And we can build next generation analytics on top of this data, build infrastructure to support digital curation. But more importantly, I think these are the two last points that are important. We need the individuals to be involved in the analytics. And what Armin said in his previous talk was, I think, really nice. When they build the apps and work with them, that was great. But we also need to change policy and culture. And that's a much larger effort, but it has to be part of the conversation. So I'll stop here saying mental health assessment needs a reboot. It doesn't need to start from scratch. A reboot is good. But every once in a while, we know all the people who use Windows machines that you have to restart the machine. There are practical sensors which can track mental health, but we really need the longitudinal data, and that's essential, and we need to get towards that. Complexity and variability will be everywhere. We don't teach all of our students enough about how to deal with it, but modern tools in data science can really help us address some of that space. And we need to focus on validation. That should be focused on long-term outcome effectiveness. Alec and I didn't talk about this at all, so the fact that he talked about that as his third point, I think, is really crucial to thinking about mental health. So I'm going to stop here and let LP take off.